This is the Waxing Lyrical with Mains and Duts podcast. The voice you're hearing is that of Duts. Our usual host, Mainsy, is away on holiday. So rather than just me speaking all by myself, which I'm sure will devastate many of you, I'm joined by the great Ben Gretch of RotoViz. He's also the host of the RotoViz radio podcast. He can be found at Twitter at the wonderful handle of Yards Per Gretch. Ben, thank you very much for joining me.
Absolutely, glad to be on with you.
As I say, you are an editor for RotoViz. Just a quick question, just in case, which I would hope not, there are people who aren't familiar with your work. How long have you been involved with RotoViz, and when did that, when did it really start? When did you start RotoViz, and when did you go into podcasting for them as well?
I started writing for RotoViz last summer in August, and wrote quite a bit throughout the season. I had written about 50 articles, I think, in January when Fantasy Douche asked me to come on as an editor, and then I had done a couple guest spots on podcasts, but I started hosting podcasts for the first time as we did the season preview. The season preview series that we just wrapped up. The last two are going to be published here this week, and we went through 32 teams in about 45 days, and we had a beat writer on for each one, and did some projections as well for each one. So a lot of work in a short amount of time, but that was a lot of fun as well. And
obviously, you're based on the West Coast, so logically, we're going to talk about the AFC West today, but continuing our division preview, not as in depth as the RotoViz one. So, first question I've got is this still the Denver Broncos division to win or lose, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's a lot of concern about their quarterback position, and probably rightfully so. Mark Sanchez has not been a particularly good quarterback at the NFL level. You have Trevor Siemian also competing for the job, and looks right now to be the favorite to win the job. Hasn't played a lot at the NFL level, was not a particularly good prospect in terms of his production in college at Northwestern. They also have first-round pick Paxton Lynch, who's in the competition, who they have very high hopes for good reason. They took him in the first round, but he's not necessarily going to be their week one starter. It could be, theoretically, but I think what's interesting is this team won the Super Bowl last year with pretty subpar quarterback play, and C.J. Anderson's a really good running back. They have two really good, really talented receivers. They have a very good defense. So that's kind of how I'm looking at it. If I'm handicapping the division, is I think the Broncos probably still have the ability to be the best team based on kind of a running the ball and strong defensive type of football.
I mean, because last year, obviously, the offense seemed to be this weird, dysfunctional hybrid of the Manning offense, even though he was physically incapable of operating it himself, and bits of the Kubiak offense. Now that it's probably going to go full over to what Kubiak wants to run, do you think that it's more likely than not that C.J. Anderson, assuming he's fit, becomes the face of this offense, as it were?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a reasonable assumption to make. I think Kubiak's running backs have been extremely productive over his time as both a coordinator and a head coach, longtime head coach in Houston, and he got great seasons out of Arian Foster. But also before that, guys like Steve Slayton, he had a great season there. And then when he went on to Baltimore, and then now to Denver, and even before that, he was offensive coordinator in Denver for a while under Mike Shanahan. So he has a long career as having productive lead running backs in his offense. And yeah, I think C.J. Anderson's an underrated runner, and I think he has the potential to be a very strong running back this year.
So we look at the projected win total for the Broncos. The line at Vegas has them at 9. Do you think that's too low, too high, just about right?
You have a hard time sometimes with Vegas lines. You assume that they're pretty accurate. If I was a gambling man, I'd probably take the over. I think, as we've already noted, that their offense wasn't particularly fluid last year, and they won more games than that. They still have a very good defense. They should still be able to run the ball. And in particular, as you noted, with Kubiak running the offense the way that he wants to now, I mean, I think there's potential for the offense to actually be a little better than last year, particularly if one of these quarterbacks, does fit into the offense well. I mean, there's a lot of unknown there, but there's potential for any of these guys to be league average, say, and their quarterback play last year wasn't league average, and they were better than that. So I think a lot of times people don't see a big name at quarterback. They think a team can't be very successful, but a really good defense, a pretty good running back, you're going to have success more often than not.
So if, ADP or, availability is no question, who's the one Bronco you'd want to draft in your fantasy team?
Without considering ADP, I think C.J. Anderson's a really good running back. I have him rated pretty highly. I think there's potential for the passing game to struggle a little bit. Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders have both been really productive receivers. I'm not as down on them as some people are this year. So I do think that they could both have decent years. I think if you're considering ADP, one guy that I really like is Virgil Green. He's pretty much going undrafted as a tight end, and he's a really athletic tight end. He played behind Julius Thomas for a couple years in Peyton Manning's best years. And then last year, Owen Daniels was mainly their lead tight end. But Owen Daniels went with Kubiak from Houston, where he was their main tight end, to Baltimore for a season, and then to Denver. So obviously there was some player familiarity there, and I think that, to be a bit of an apologist for Virgil, that might be a reason that Virgil didn't get on the field as much last year as possible. And I think this year, really good athletic profile. He's like 28 now. He's getting up there in age and hasn't done a ton. I think he has 44 career receptions, or 44 career targets, one of those two. But on that limited workload, he has had a pretty very efficient profile. He's been very good in a yards per target sense. He's been very good with his catch rate. And I think this year he has the potential to finally be the tight end one on a team, and I have high hopes for him as well.
And is there any Bronco who you particularly don't want any part of at any stage?
I think the quarterbacks are tough. I think Devontae Booker has a really good profile as a rookie running back. He's kind of earning their number 2 spot right now, and there's a lot of optimism for him. He's somebody that I'm probably shying away from because I do think C.J. Anderson is an underrated runner, and I think he'll handle the bulk of the work in terms of the running game. And then any wide receiver 3, I'm probably not really interested in this offense either, because those top 2 receivers tend to dominate the targets. And there's Cody Latimers and the Benny Fowlers. There's a couple names there that people have wanted to break out for years, but this offense hasn't really had a good number 3 receiver for a while, and I don't think that's really going to change either.
Moving across the division to the Kansas City Chiefs, they obviously ended the regular season last year as one of the form teams, if not the form team in the NFL. Do you see their form carrying over into this season, and can they seriously challenge to win the division rather than having to rely on wildcard spots?
Yeah, I think they can. I mean, Jamal Charles is back healthy. They did well without him, as you noted. But he's, in my opinion, one of the best running backs in the league. The ACL repair is a concern, but we've seen some positive comebacks from that in recent seasons. Notably, Adrian Peterson came back and ran for 2,000 yards the year after that, after his ACL tear. So I don't, it's hard to just assume the positive and the most optimistic scenario, but they're set up where if Charles isn't on the field a ton, they have 2 good running backs behind him in Spencer Ware and Charkandrick West. They have a smart quarterback in Alex Smith, I would say. He's kind of known as a check down artist. He doesn't really push the ball down the field, but also doesn't tend to turn the ball over a ton. You have Jeremy Maclin as a really good wide receiver 1, Travis Kelce as a emerging, potentially, the offense kind of limits him, but a emerging young tight end, very athletic, and then also a pretty strong defense there too. So I think I think absolutely they can challenge Denver.
I mean, as you say, Alex Smith is, he's not exactly going to fill the air with footballs, but he is, he's very safe, very steady. You know what you're going to get from him. How much of a concern do you think it would be, even with the great running game, were he to get injured and the offense have to be turned over to the likes of Nick Foles or maybe rookie Kevin Hogan? Do you think that would be a serious knock-on for this team?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty big drop-off. I think Alex Smith gets a little bit of a hard time for being a little bit safe. And from a fantasy football perspective, he's not necessarily the great option, but he always chips in some running ability. He's an athletic guy. He seems to know when to tuck it and run. He seems to know how to not put the offense in jeopardy with questionable throws. He's more likely to just throw a ball away than to force something. Those other guys, Kevin Hogan's kind of an unknown, but particularly Nick Foles, he's had one really strong season under Chip Kelly, really a partial season while he was in Philadelphia, but other than that, he has not been a very productive NFL quarterback. I think that's a pretty substantial drop from a real football standpoint, and it would probably impact the offense overall.
The win total for the Chiefs is at 9.5, so they're slight favourites to this division. Do you volatility of this total? But do you think over or under on 9.5?
Give me the over. I'll take them as a 10-6 team, or maybe an 11-5 team. I think, as I noted, that they're a pretty well-rounded team. They don't have a ton of holes. Obviously, if something were to happen to Alex Smith, that could be problematic. But they have plenty of potential.
So I think you mentioned earlier Jamal Charles is back. Would he be, your fantasy go-to guy for the Chiefs, or would it be the likes of Kelsey or maybe Jeremy Maclin?
Charles is the big name. He's going, I think, running back 8 right now in ADP. I see him as a top 3 running back if he's healthy. In PPR leagues, which is what I primarily play, point per reception leagues, because he catches a lot of balls. And I think Spencer Ware will probably get a lot of the between the tackles work, or more than some of the backup running backs have seen throughout Charles' career, at least after Charles became the lead back. Early in his career, he was kind of a combo back with Thomas Jones, but once he became the lead back, he's had a pretty hefty workload at times. I think we'll see that come down just a bit, enough to give Spencer Ware some of the work, and maybe he gets some of the red zone touches, although Jamal Charles has been extremely efficient in the red zone and a really good touchdown producer. But the key thing is the passing down work. As good as Jamal Charles is as a receiver, I just don't see any way that they're going to keep from getting him the ball. And, he's pretty much a lock for, 50, 60 receptions. It's just, if he's healthy for 16 games, it's just the way that he plays and the way that, along with Alex Smith kind of being willing to check down the ball, he's going to get you a lot of catches, going to have a really stable floor, and he's extremely efficient. I think he's been over 5 yards per carry in every year of his career, which is just an absolutely absurd stat. That's if you do that once in your career, that's really impressive, but that's something that he's done year in and year out. So for me, he's the guy. He's really the guy for this offense, and I think he's a value in fantasy drafts for sure. And
the people that you'd probably shy away from, I would imagine it would be the secondary pass catchers, notably the likes of Chris Conley, Albert Wilson.
Albert Wilson, I'm not real high on. I'm interested in Conley. He's a really athletic player, and you can get him pretty late in drafts. So, I don't have really high expectations necessarily. And as you noted, as being a secondary option in this offense, it's kind of questionable how much work he'll get and whether they'll be able to push the ball downfield to him and utilize his athleticism. You'll probably see Maclin dominate a lot of the targets. You'll see Charles catch a lot of balls. You'll see Kelsey catch some balls. So a guy like Chris Conley's probably not in a great position to get a lot of work, but I think he's an interesting player in the sense that, if something were to happen to Maclin, or just if he just emerges, there's potential for him to be a highly efficient player because he is a very good athlete. So he's interesting to me. I'm not necessarily shying away from him where you can draft him in drafts.
I personally hope he does very well because anyone who makes their own Star Wars film in college, they're okay by me.
I had not heard that. What's the story behind that?
I'm not entirely sure the full, but I know he and I think it was a film class or something when he was at college. They made like a proper Star Wars fan film. You see, the types you see him on the internet. They made quite a detailed one. So
that's fantastic. That's a good footnote right there. I'm going to remember that one.
Absolutely. There's not enough nerds in the NFL, I don't think.
Agreed.
Okay, the next team look at is one of the improving teams that everyone would think. It's the Oakland Raiders. Obviously, they've been, I'm going to try and be polite, a joke for the best part of 15 years. Is the tide turning for the Raiders, and do you think this year is going to be the return to something like relevance for them?
Yeah, I can see that. I think they're an interesting team. I really do. I think their defense is certainly improved. Khalil Mack is one of the better defenders in the entire league, and a really good pass rusher. You're going to see him be able to put pressure on the quarterback. When you can pressure the quarterback, that makes a lot of good things happen defensively. Derek Carr was good as a young quarterback thus far. He's been fine. But I worry a little bit about him long term, but I think he's a pretty decent quarterback. He can get the ball downfield. He can get the ball to the receivers. He has a big arm. And you're talking about one of the best young receivers in the league in Amari Cooper. He had an amazing prospect profile coming in. He had a strong year last year and recently was quoted as saying, don't judge me on my rookie year. Whatever you see on tape, that's not really the real me, because his foot injury was bugging him most of the year. I've heard that it's a plantar fasciitis type thing, and those things can linger, so there's maybe a slight concern there. But if he's fully healthy, he's going to be pretty darn good. And Carr's a guy I think that can get him the ball as long as he's not turning it over too much. This offense would be well off with the ball in Amari Cooper's hands. You still have a good second receiver in Michael Crabtree. They drafted DeAndre Washington as a change of pace back. Behind Latavius Murray, who's going to kind of be their workhorse. And they also got I believe it's pronounced Kalichi Osemele, who was one of the best, I think probably considered the best free agent offensive lineman this year. Was a Raven last year. They signed him as well. So there's certainly reason for optimism for this team.
One of the more polarizing figures in fantasy, you did mention, it's Latavius Murray. I mean, they do see the noise that comes out of the Raiders is that they're not totally sold on him. Do you think he's still viable for fantasy, or is he someone who maybe could start well, but then when you really need him, with the fancy players time, he's already checked out for the season?
Yeah, I think that's a potential concern. Absolutely, he wasn't extremely efficient last year. He had a 4.0 yards per carry, not world-beating by any means, but he did carry the ball a significant amount of times, 266 carries, which is quite a lot. Only one running back, Adrian Peterson, last year had 300 carries. You used to see 300 carry seasons a lot more frequently than you see nowadays in the NFL, so he was a reliable guy in their offense last year. The question is, whether he could fade towards the end of the season. Yeah, I absolutely could see that, and you might see DeAndre Washington work in more at times if kind of, getting some nicks and bruises here and there, and it's affecting his play. But I do expect him to start the season to be pretty heavily involved and kind of their main back at first, at least. So, whether he can weather another 16-game season is certainly up for debate. I think every running back who sees that kind of a workload is questionable in that sense. So that's certainly a concern for a lot of backs that are similar to him.
So we've already had the Broncos and the Chiefs. We think, they're going to have 10-win seasons. The Raiders line is 8.5. Now, obviously, I think it's only been 8-8. Is it once or twice since 2002? Can they get over the hump this year?
Yeah, that's a questionable one. I think, as I noted, they're improved. I'm kind of taking the wait and see approach with them. I think they're probably more like an 8-8 team. But this is I think a really good line, because I think that there's certainly potential for them to be a 9-7 team. I think this could be one of the better divisions in the AFC. If you look around the AFC, there's some teams that in each division that are not necessarily in great positions, and there's a couple good teams in this division. So I could see the AFC West being one of the better divisions in the league in the conference this year. And yeah, I mean, I could certainly see them going over. This is probably one that I'm less confident on, but I'll say under. I'll say 8-8 is what I would guess for him. Probably not much to the chagrin of Raiders fans.
Oh, you don't really want Raiders Nation coming after you.
Yeah, that's a dangerous proposition there.
So when it comes to fantasy, you've already mentioned Derek Carr. That's one of the first times I've ever actually called him that first time. I usually call him David. Is he the type of quarterback you'd be happy to get late in the draft if you do wait on your quarterbacks?
Yeah, I tend to wait on quarterbacks. He's a guy that will throw the ball a fair amount. This offense, like I said, has the receivers that they want to feature. He threw 573 passes last year. As a team, they threw over 600 passes, which used to be a number that was hard to hit, but last year 15 teams hit that. As recently as about 5 years ago, there were only about 4 teams per year hitting that number, that 600 attempt threshold. And the Raiders were one of the teams that hit it last year. I would expect them to throw in that range again. So in terms of just pure volume, you should get a lot of pass attempts. And then Amari Cooper, one of his skills and one of the traits that people are really high on him is yards after the catch. He's an extremely elusive receiver once he gets the ball in his hands. There's definitely some highlights from last year that show that off. I know there's one that gets shown around a lot where he ran a kind of a comeback route against Patrick Peterson and really shook Peterson and then caught the ball and was getting upfield kind of in one fluid motion and was able to add another, I think it's 20 or 30 yards on that play. And that's kind of the thing that people are hoping for from Cooper is that he can, take some 10-yard catches and turn them into 25, 35-yard gains. So, I think Carr, from that sense, absolutely could be an option. There are a couple other quarterbacks later in drafts that I also really like. Andy Dalton's the one that I really like. But Carr's not a guy that I'm shying away from by any means because I think he has weapons around him and an offense that should throw enough that could make him a worthwhile draft pick.
And while you say you don't really want Raiders Nation coming after you, is there any particular Raider you don't really want on your fantasy teams?
One guy is Clive Walford. He's their young tight end, and some people are taking him as like a tight end 2 and thinking that he has some upside. I think he's going about tight end 20 right now, so right in that tight end 2 range. Bill Musgrave, the offensive coordinator, he's used tight ends at times in his offenses, but at other stops he didn't use them. I think in Minnesota he tended to use his tight ends a little bit more. But prior to that, he was a coordinator for the Jaguars back in 2003, 2004. He wasn't using his tight ends as much. And so I tend to look at his last 2 years in Oakland as a coordinator and give that the most relevance because he hasn't been consistent earlier in his with his tendencies earlier in his coaching career. So when I look at the last couple of years, the Raiders didn't really feature the tight end a lot, and I think kind of with this personnel and the offense they've ran the last couple of years, they've been more willing to get the ball to the receivers. So he's a guy that I'm kind of shying away from. I tend to go 0 running back in drafts as well, which means just kind of drafting running backs later. So I tend not to get guys like Latavius Murray. I think he definitely has some viability, but he's another guy that I'm probably not drafting on my own teams.
So the last team in this division is the San Diego Chargers. They've got the threat or the spectre of relocation hanging over them. They can't get their first round draft pick signed. Could this team's talent on the field just be overwhelmed by factors out of their control off the field?
Yeah, it's hard to say if the off-the-field stuff will impact their play, but I think there are some questions about how talented they are on the field as well. I mean, they were 4-12 last year. I would expect them to hopefully, for Chargers fans, not be a 4-12 team again this year. Be a little better than that. They were one of the worst teams in the league last year. But I don't have particularly high hopes for them. I do think they're probably the best bet to finish at the bottom of the division. That's if there's one thing that I would be I don't want to say that I'm confident about it, but potentially most confident about is that I don't think that the Chargers are going to be competing with the other three teams. At least I don't know that they have the personnel to do that this year. So I don't know whether the off the field stuff, it certainly doesn't help, but I don't know really if on the field if they have enough talent to do it.
I mean, what is your take with the Joey Bosa thing? I mean, is it that both are at fault? The club should just suck it up and say it's a first round pick. We picked him this early. Is he being unreasonable? Do you have any thoughts or blame one way or the other?
It's interesting. They released a statement today and kind of detailed out their entire process with him, what their offer was, and that it was their best offer and that it was still not accepted, and then what that means going forward in terms of they'll probably be offering less because he's now missing more time. To me, I think both sides come out looking bad. I think more so the team. Significantly more so, I should say, because I think the tie-up is this offset language, which is I'm not real good on the contract stuff, but I'm pretty sure it's just a clause that is put in a lot of these rookie contracts that essentially makes it harder for the team to cut a player after a year or two if they're not performing, essentially. And a lot of these players tend to want that, whether it's the offset language in the contract or out of the contract, I'm not sure, but it essentially makes it so that it's more beneficial to them. Clearly, both sides want it to be more beneficial to them, but I think in Bosa's sense, he's looking for something that a lot of other rookies have gotten in contracts around the league, and then the Chargers are kind of trying to frame it as, hey, we're offering you a ton of guaranteed money, we're offering you all these other things, but they don't want to give him that offset benefit, whatever it is. I don't know the specifics of it, but I think based on my understanding, it's something that is in a lot of rookie contracts, high picks contracts. It's become more common in the last few years, and so the Chargers are kind of doing things a little bit weird, not being willing to include that. So that, to me, is not a good sign. You know, you draft a guy really high in the draft, and you're unwilling to kind of play by the rules that a lot of the other teams are playing by. At least that's my understanding. So that, to me, is kind of more on the...
I think it's one of those. I think the offset language is if they cut him still in his rookie deal and he signs somewhere else, the Chargers, don't have to pay. He can't double dip. Basically, his new team have to pay some of his salary, so he can't just get his full guarantee from the Chargers and then go and get a big contract elsewhere. I think so. I think that's my understanding of it.
Interesting. Yeah, I can't say I have a full understanding of it. I thought that sounds like it wouldn't be much of a risk for Bosa then. And I thought it was more of a risk for Bosa, but is that kind of not the case based on your understanding?
Based on my understanding, I think it's the player wants. I think the player wants to double dip. He wants to get his full guarantees from the Chargers, and then should something happen and he gets cut, he can then go and sign as big a deal as he wants elsewhere. So he gets, he gets the money from San Diego, and he gets the money from where the miscreants usually go, the Patriots, someone like that. But I could be wrong. I'm not a cap expert myself. I say they just seem to be replete with problems, and it's the fact that we are at the stage of the season where we're not really you're not seeing an awful lot of talk about the Chargers, the players. You're just seeing about you being this contract thing that's running and running. It doesn't usually lead to successful seasons. I find in any sport, when this much stuff is being talked about off the field rather than on it.
Oh, I totally agree with that. I mean, I do think that stuff can come into play, and certainly, when you draft a guy third overall in the draft, and you can't get him into camp for one reason or another, whoever you want to assign blame to. I mean, I'd have to research that a little bit more, and I'll definitely trust your word on it. And in trusting your word, it sounds like that potentially Bosa's, asking for something that's not necessarily. I don't know. I guess I would say if I was a Chargers fan, I wouldn't want him to be held off the field for those reasons, and I'd probably be a little frustrated with him as well. But I can totally agree with that, and hear your point in terms of the off-field distractions, in the sense that he's, their top 5 pick. Everyone was really excited about that after the draft, and now here we are, just a few weeks before the season starts, and the guy hasn't even been, at practice. So, that can certainly get into the heads of the team a little bit.
So we've got, as you said, this is probably the team that's likely to finish bottom of the division. Win total 7.5. It seems a bit high to me.
Yeah, I would probably take the under. I don't know that this team's going to be an 8-8 team. That's interesting though, because that, based on the 4 lines that you said, it sounds like Vegas's expectation is that the AFC West will be a pretty good team as well, or division as well. You got 3 teams expected to be over 8-8, 9.5, 9, and 8.5, and then 1 at 7.5. So they're certainly expecting this division to be better than 8-8 on average. But I would say probably for the Chargers that I don't expect them to hit 8 wins. I would probably take the under on that, particularly because they got to play 6 games against those other 3 teams that all look like pretty strong teams.
So when it comes to fantasy, they did have someone who was on pace for historic numbers last season, and Keenan Allen. Do you think he's a value at where he's currently going in drafts?
I'm a huge Keenan Allen fan. I think he's a really talented player. I think he's a very good player for where the NFL's going. In the last 5 seasons, the average depth of target league-wide has dropped every season. Teams are throwing shorter passes, but as I noted, they're also throwing more passes. The number of teams that have thrown over 600 passes has shot up. So you're not seeing necessarily the top teams throwing more, but you're seeing more and more teams be pass-heavy, and they're throwing shorter passes. So they're willing to kind of use the short passing game as an extension of the run game. A lot of that has to do with the rule changes where DBs can't put their hands on the receivers as much. So you can throw these short passes. And when you're playing in point per receptions leagues, a guy like Keenan Allen is exactly the kind of guy that can have a really good year, because he can just rack up receptions, even if they're 4 or 5 yard receptions. He only played 8 games last year, and he had sorry about this, I don't have it right in front of me.
That's quite all right. Neither do I.
He had 3 games with over 12 receptions in that 8-game sample, and he got injured in the 8th game. So really played more heavily in 7 games, and 3 games with 12 or more receptions, which in all 3 games he had at least 133 yards. So you're looking at, in point per reception, 25 points or more in all those games, because you're racking up so many receptions. Even if he's not heavily used in the red zone, which has been kind of a knock on him the last couple years, he did have more touchdowns in his rookie year. He's played for 3 seasons now, so that was a couple years ago, back in 2013. But even if he's not scoring as much, and even if he's not getting downfield and getting these 20-yard receptions really frequently, if he just racks up a ton of receptions, he's a guy that can be really good for you in those point-per-reception leagues. So I really like him. Yeah, I think he's a good value in the second round as a guy that can be really stable, and then also have these weeks where he just really blows up in terms of how many balls he catches and gets you a ton of points.
And when it comes to someone who, you're probably not, well, speaking for myself, someone I'm not overly keen on having in, based on the fact that we think this is probably going to be a poor team, they're going to be throwing an awful lot. Melvin Gordon does cede an awful lot of the passing work to Danny Woodhead, and given that he was, again, I'm desperate to be polite, not very good last season, I'm just not certain I can find a place for him where he's going at the moment.
Yeah, I think he's interesting, though, because he didn't score at all last year, and, touchdowns from year to year, the touchdown rates can tend to fluctuate a little bit. For how many touches he got, for him to not have any touchdowns last year was pretty notable, and that, in large part, kind of drives the narrative of how poor he was. He wasn't good on a yards per carry basis either, so that certainly didn't help if he wasn't scoring, and he also wasn't producing on a yards per carry basis. He wasn't doing a ton. He like you said, it wasn't very heavily utilized in the passing game either. So, but I do think there's some potential here for. I think the team wants to use him more. He was a first-round pick. He had a really good profile coming out of Wisconsin. He's only played 1 season. It was a poor season, but any time in the NFL you have a 1 year guy with a poor year. We're only looking at a 16 game sample. That's not a huge sample. I do think there's potential for him to bounce back this year. I mean, again, another red flag. He had microfracture surgery this offseason, but the reports on that have been really good. Our Dr. Jeff Butoff at RotoViz, writes for the site, noted that based on the things that he's been hearing, he obviously hasn't seen the medical records, but based on the things he's been hearing, that it sounds optimistic. When we had Kevin Acey from the San Diego Union Tribune on our RotoViz Radio season preview show, he said that Melvin Gordon looked really healthy, but he also expressed some concern about Melvin Gordon's pass blocking, so that might not bode well for Gordon to get on the field more in passing scenarios. It might be a big reason why Woodhead was still so heavily involved last year. I think Gordon's going late enough that I'll probably take a few shots in drafts on him and just hope that you get some positive regression and hope that his profile shines through in his second year and he starts to see a pretty significant workload as well. But I also agree with you on the team level stuff where the game script could be bad for them and they end up throwing a lot in second halves, and that might limit their ability to run the ball.
Well, that brings to the end the AFC West all done and dusted. Ben, thanks very much for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to come on and appreciate the invite.
And where can people find you? I said at the start, but where can they find you? And what work have you got upcoming?
Yeah, you can find almost all my work at RotoViz. I had one piece published at RotoWorld, but the rest of my articles have always been exclusively at RotoViz. I have a lot of podcasting stuff upcoming. We just finished the season preview series. I'm starting a DFS podcast with RotoDoc, the doctor of mathematics, Nick Giffen, that writes for the site. Very intelligent guy. We've put out a couple episodes there. We'll be doing that weekly. And then also, to start the season, we'll be doing a weekly podcast with Pat Corain, again, my co-host for the season preview podcast. Will be taking over the RotoViz Radio flagship show. So that'll be a lot of fun. In terms of pieces I'm working on, I got kind of caught up on a lot of pieces. I'm looking at a couple more ideas, but I don't know what I'm going to actually get done. I just had one come out today that was just kind of a draft strategy article about how to kind of sometimes build back to front in your draft. If there's guys that you really like maybe in the 12th or 14th round and you think they're really good values, you think they're more of like a 6th round value, lock those guys in essentially maybe a round or two before their ADP, so you make sure you get them, and then consider how that allows you to free up your early round picks. Basically, if you're really high on some running backs later in the draft and you know you're going to make sure you get those guys later, tailor your early round strategy to that, and then make sure you pick those guys later on. And I think that's a kind of an interesting strategy. It's something that I like to do to make sure that I end up getting a roster that is filled with guys that I really like. If you don't do that in the early part of the draft, you wind up drafting for need as you get later on. But if you kind of figure out what you want to do in certain situations in the middle or later rounds of the draft, and if you're not, if you're comfortable with reaching a little bit for a guy that you really like, maybe a round or two earlier than he tends to go, that can help you build a strategy in the first couple rounds as well. And then you don't get caught chasing runs, or you don't get caught trying to pick a guy that you don't really like just because he's falling lower than his ADP. You can really stick to kind of a strategy where at the end of the draft you can be comfortable and happy with the team that you've drafted. So that was an article that came out today. I think that's an interesting strategy to consider in drafts as well.
Certainly is. Should be sure to check that out over at RotoViz. So for Ben Gretch at Yards for Gretch, I'm Neil Dutton. Thanks for downloading.